But thank you again for coming on a work night too. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully this is um interesting. I'm actually always more excited for the Q&A, so I'm going to keep it pretty tight um and be really interested to hear what people think. I'm going to share my screen right here. Um okay, let me get Can you see this? Yeah, I'm sure you can.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to start just very quickly. I My background is a little bit weird, and maybe this is also related to the kind of work that I do. I was a high school English teacher many, many moons ago, but I was trained as an elementary school teacher, and I was a high school teacher in Los Angeles, actually. And I went to teachers college in New York City really because I wanted to move to New York City, and I plan on going back to be a high school English teacher after living in New York City for a while. Somehow, I started teaching community college and then decided to do a PhD. So, the reason I'm saying that is because I started in my PhD program, we had to teach undergraduate courses, and I was teaching about race and education pretty early on. Um, and so that was like 2011, maybe. Barack Obama still was president. And, it was just a very different landscape for trying to do this kind of work. And I think if I think about myself at that time, the way that I approached the work of teaching about race to future teachers primarily was this idea of like building a case, like proving the facts, proving that race was something that future teachers should attend to. It's something that white teachers should care about. And here are the facts. Here's the kind of the missing education. It was kind of like very like lawyerly case building. And, that worked to some degree. It worked for students that were interested and engaged, but um, it was a kind of limit to it. There was a limit to it. And kind of many years later, I've been teaching these classes about race and education in education schools of education and found there was like again this stuckness, this kind of like focus on the rules, focus on language, over focus on language. Um, in a way that I don't think really indicated any meaningful understanding of how these things work. Um, my third year here, my second year here, I was given a class to teach in art education. Art education on our campus is not in the School of Ed, it's in the art department. The reason I was given this class is because I was doing a project on street art and they needed someone who could teach this class. So it was an opportunity that I was really excited about. And I taught this class for 3 years. Um, my th- my third year, I started teaching a pop culture class in women, gender, sexuality studies. So I was in three different departments teaching about race, gender, sexuality, class. And one of the things I noticed was the kinds of conversations we could have in pop culture and in contemporary art were very, very, very different than in education. And it's still something I'm trying to figure out. But one of the things that was happening in art education and in women, gender, sexuality studies is we had a lot of shared text, not just academic text, but pop culture was like we'd talk about something, we would talk about Miley Cyrus appropriating Black aesthetics, and then we'd watch the video together and we talk about the different things that we saw. And we talked about how that relates to um, race, gender, femininity, beauty, appropriation. And we could have these really meaningful conversations. And the same thing happened in contemporary art, was we would look at art together and we would talk through these things, what we were seeing, what we were not seeing. So that's kind of how I got onto this. And then I started making art myself, which gave me another view of what kinds of thinking can come from a different process, a different engagement with images. So, there we go. Okay, all right. Was this working?
I'm seeing your title slide. There we go.
There you go. So I'm going to start with stories, this idea of a story. Thanks, Catherine. What are your stories about race and racism? And where do those stories come from? I'm teaching race and gender right now, and this is the question that I asked the grad students. And some of the things they said were very interesting. TV, film, family, um, school. And we really spent all term thinking about where these stories come from. So there's obviously these stories come from all these different places. But today I want to think about how the image teaches us stories about race and racism. So here's a couple quotes maybe that we can think with together. Well, I have to move this. Stories such as race, class, gender, and nation are hegemonic. They are discursive practices that shape us ideologically and bodily and that come with violent, although not only violent effects. That's from this really incredible book called How to Make Art at the End of the World, and this one as well. Stories are powerful. The stories that we believe, these stories that we live into shape our daily practices from moment to moment. They encourage us to see some things and not others. Entrenched stories like race, gender, class, and nation have historically done this very well, prescribing who might accomplish what, where, when, and how. Um, and then this is from Catherine McKittrick's Dear Science and Other Stories. I'm interested in how we imagine ways of knowing that past in excess of knowing the past in excess of the fictions of the archive, but not only that. I'm interested too in the ways we recognize the many manifestations of that fiction and that excess, that past not yet past in the present. So, this idea of where we know and how stories tell us and how stories inform our knowing. All right, that's not going to work. So, some of the assumptions and claims that I'm working with today are maybe provocative, I don't know, maybe not, um, is this idea about literacy being about expansion and imagination, not enclosure, reproduction, or matching. I think that the ways we talk about meaning making is kind of a loop often, right? In schooling spaces, we often have one kind of version and we want students to match that version. I think that that is the wrong direction. um, Looking as historical, political, sociocultural, and it's often already aligned with existing hierarchies. We are socialized and disciplined to see in some ways and not others. What we see matters to how we relate to others and how we imagine ourselves in relation. So I think about stories about smart, if we were talking about education, stories about smartness, stories about artists and who are not artists. And these stories kind of can limit or expand how we are able to imagine ourselves. And I think that paying attention to the ways that we're looking can teach us how to learn differently and look differently. Look differently. So in ways that account for care and the different inheritance, social inheritance uh, that kind of limit our ways of seeing. So I'm very interested in how do we use teaching and learning to facilitate critical imaginary, creativity, speculation, connection, and potential. And then probably many of you are familiar with Maxine Green's uptake of wide awakeness, right? This kind of paying attention to the world in a particular ongoing way, which makes me think of slowness and care as counters to the immediacy of vision. We are kind of inundated with images now, which we always have been, but I think the digital space has kind of accelerated a certain kind of looking that is very quick and immediate and really does discourage kind of care and sitting with and reflecting. Kind of reminds me of Tina Camp. Tina Camp came to our campus. She lives in this area. And in her book, which I will reference a little bit today, A Black Gaze, she talks about going to um, art exhibits and sitting on the floor and how that really does facilitate a different kind of relationship to the art that she's looking at, right? Like if you're sitting, you are looking and you're taking time and there is an attention that is very different than if you're walking through um, a museum or in a gallery. So this is also McKittrick bringing together again story and the image. If we do not collaboratively call into question a system of knowledge that delights in accumulation by dispossession and profits for ecocidal and genocidal practices, if we do not produce and share stories that honors modes of humanness that cannot and will not replicate this system, we are doomed. This also reminds me of Donna Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble, about really thinking about how can we relate and be and know in a way that is different from the ways that we are now, because this is not working. I think that's pretty clear. And then this is from Sadia Hartman's What Are the Stories One Tells in Dark Times? How can a narrative of defeat enable a place for the living or envision an alternative future? So I think also part of this, like looking differently, being differently with images, allowing ourselves to learn new stories about the world, new stories about race and gender and humanness can make space for another future than the one that we are currently heading toward. And I think that really Black contemporary art has always been concerned with that. Um, but I follow Camp's work thinking about how Black contemporary art right now is doing something very interesting um, in relation to some of these questions. So I'm thinking a lot about ruptures. This is a word that Bell Hooks uses, really talking about pop culture. The chapter on the oppositional gaze, where she's talking primarily about film, but it's in the 90s. So thinking about the ways that art, pop culture sometimes can create a rupture of the story that we have, the stuck story, the looped, the repetitive story can then be either ruptured, interrupted, challenged, undermined, even for a moment. And then you might go back to the previous story. But I think that thinking about rupture as an ongoing practice is very exciting to me because when those ruptures happen again and again, the story has to change. There's not the story becomes unreliable. This is Tara Wack, who is a really amazing artist and rapper who does a really cool visual work in the genre of the music video. So I think part of like what I'm always interested in as a teacher is how to encourage students to put themselves in positions where they are looking for that rupture, right? Where they're not sticking to the repetition of the stories that they're comfortable with. And what does that look like? I think for me personally, I mean, I'm going back a very long time, subculture, art subcultures, punk subcultures, actually in Southern California, was this space that really was totally counter to what I was learning in school and in the suburban town that I was growing up in. That there were totally different perspectives about things, totally different ways of looking at things, and how I just wanted more and more and more. And that really has been the way that I've wanted to live, is always wanting to have that experience that leaves me thinking, that destabilizes me, right? And so some of the things that I think about doing is the collaborative looking, which I think I sort of reference, really thinking about how news media, kind of the everyday images, can be a space of rupture if you're looking at it with a critique, right? What is this? What is the story that this is telling? And who benefits from this story? And what are the other stories? Just checking my time. Um, Critically viewing, listening, pop culture. I love pop culture, as we'll see a little later, that pop culture is kind of not the end point, or doesn't have to meet. I think I'm going to trouble this a little bit, but pop culture, And there is a lot of artists, films, TV shows that are challenging. I mean, maybe people would say that they were not pop culture, that they were more avant-garde, but I think there's a lot of blurring of boundaries around that right now. And contemporary art, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more, are all kind of spaces of trying to chase that rupture, right? And what kind of education, how is that a different kind of education than the one that is mostly on offer um, around not just race, but race, how race works in relation to other gender, sexuality, class. Um, okay, so this is from a really great book by Paul C. Taylor. Black is Beautiful. And he says that one of the central tasks of the Black aesthetic tradition has been to expose the whitely pretensions to universality and neutrality that deny Black perspectives and to cultivate resources that might inform these alternative ways of seeing. So, this idea that whiteness is universal and that is apolitical and neutral, that is very much kind of in the milieu, right? That's a lot of that is taken for granted. To speak to visuality is to point to the cultural screen that shapes perception, the field of pre-existing meanings that makes some states of affairs visible to us while others remain beneath our notice. So that is part of what I'm so interested in, is like the ways that race, we are all socialized to notice race, often overcoding any other thing. And that is an inherited way of seeing. And it's not, we don't, it's noticing race for racialized people, right? That's kind of the first thing that is noticed in many settings, because that's what we have been socialized to notice. And what is the violence in that type of noticing? Um, okay, I'm just gonna skip that. So I think I've already said this. This is a picture of Love is the Message is Death, Arthur Jafa. Really, you can look it up on YouTube. It's a 7-minute long video of different found clips with Kanye West's Ultralight Beam song. I would recommend if you ever have a chance to see it. I saw it in person. I always teach with it. It's an amazing artifact, cultural artifact. Um, the artist, Arthur Jafa, is a cinematographer and an artist. So that's the art is the editing. He's also friends with Tina Camp. So there's a lot of just really deep thinking. I actually can we can talk about it later. So some of these questions that I really have students ask when we are looking at things together is, when I'm seeing a picture of people or a person, who do I identify with? And how does that identification frame how I see? What is known, seen, understood, imagined anew? What did you see that you might have otherwise missed? Why does that matter to you? So these kinds of questions, I mean, these are not prescriptive, but any sort of questions that allow us to slow down and really think about what it is we're noticing and what we're not noticing, and how that noticing tells a story, and how that story either is aligned with the stories that we are already how that we've already inherited, or are those stories a departure? Or is there a different story that can come from some of these images? So this is just, I don't know if anyone remembers, this was a student who did an ongoing performance art project where she carried around a mattress after a sexual assault. This was at Columbia. And this was a picture of her. She carried around the mattress until graduation. She also carried it to graduation. Um, and it's an image that, if you were aware of it, is kind of a sticky image. It stays with you. Um, and thinking about the different ways that someone can look at this image is part of what I'm talking about. Is what is of interest here? What are some stories that are held when you come to this image, right? Stories about college, stories about gender, sexuality, safety, um, Columbia being an elite institution, that also kind of can counter or complicate some of the stories that one might have about this image and subsequent images. She was treated pretty badly after as a result because what she was doing carrying the mattress was so disruptive to the kinds of ways of being in the college space. Um, but I think she's doing very well. I think she's still so that's the same idea. I'm kind of going, here's a couple other images kind of just from our media landscape that kind of, there's a lot of different ways to look at these things, and how you look and what you notice and what you don't notice is really about the stories that are taken from images. This is from Hurricane Katrina. So I mentioned that I teach pop culture. Pop culture is something that students are very, very comfortable with. And so there's kind of an interesting way that their defenses are down in a way that's very different in the class, the race and gender class. So there's so much that can be done in this space. I have this picture of Whitney Houston being interviewed. We often learn about Whitney Houston because Whitney Houston is such a space to think about race, gender, and how race and gender has shifted and changed over time. Um, Her career, how she was treated, her death. It's very interesting that very young students were very interested in Whitney Houston. So they spend a lot of time asking questions. And if this is a famous interview where the questions are so inappropriate and so invasive. Students are always very shocked because it shows like a very different time, the early 2000s to now. But we use this to really think about some of these things. How is race working? How might Whitney Houston's life be different? How was race working then versus now, the beginning of their career and the end of her career? So we really use pop culture as data, as a site of inquiry, and to rupture kind of the loops of meaning making that are so prevalent, that are so dominant and disciplined. But then Tina Camps brings up this point that I take to heart, um, talking about the Black pop culture. While contemporary Black produced popular culture brings broader visibility to Black life and history, more often than not, its emphasis centers on depiction of Black people and communities while maintaining existing limitations of traditional ways of narrating the Black experience. It adds an additional perspective, a Black perspective, but it doesn't necessarily challenge the fundamental premise of the existing frameworks for viewing Blackness. It does not challenge the fundamental disparity that defines the dominant viewing practice, the fact that Blackness is the elsewhere or nowhere of whiteness. So she doesn't really she sees the potential of pop culture. And I think there's a lot of pop culture that I think does blur the line between pop culture and contemporary art. But I do think it's an important point. And what she says instead is that a lot of Black artists and mainstream um, Black artists, fine artists, I should say, Black fine artists are initiating a different and I would argue more transformative cultural, aesthetic, and indeed political shift that is drawing unprecedented attention. They are shifting the very nature of our interactions with the visual through their creation and quite literal curation of a distinctively Black gaze. It is a gaze that is energizing and infusing Black popular culture in striking and unorthodox ways. So she's saying that Black contemporary art Black contemporary art is influencing Black popular culture. I think about the show Atlanta, uh, which is very, to me, artistic. There's a lot of different examples. I would say Tara Wack is also a rapper who is kind of blurring the lines between art and pop culture. Um, so and then McKittrick talks about the story cannot tell itself without our willingness to imagine what it cannot tell. The story asks that we live with what cannot be explained and live with unexplained cues and diasporic literacies rather than reams of positivist evidence. So that goes back to me starting my career, college teaching career, trying to build a case of evidence. Um, the story opens the door to curiosity. The reams of evidence dissipate as we live with the difficult and frustrating ways of knowing differentially. So that's what I think the ideal is moving toward the ways that McKittrick describes the story. So here's some art. Again, looking at art in this way is not the best environment, but we'll do our best. And let's see what my time is. Um, okay, good. Pretty good. So this is Carrie James Marshall's. This is a series called Accessories. I saw this in person. It's very difficult to see on the screen. Um, but the art that I'm going to show, I think, does a lot of these things that Tina Camp talks about that can tell a different story um and that different story allows for other new stories to come out of that story. So these are pretty large. I don't know the dimensions offhand, but um they are pictures of a lynching or photographs of a lynching. And it's all washed out. You have to look pretty closely to see. Um, and the thing that you can see very well is are people, they're three white women who are in the audience. And I think that this is kind of again a shift of attention in a way that is meaningful. Um, I wrote my dissertation about using art to teach race. This was many, many years ago. And this was from an exhibit that was on our campus. And thinking about what's missing as another way of thinking about story. Um, these were two pieces that students wrote a lot about at the time. This is Ebony Patterson's work, who does a lot of really cool, who did a lot of really cool pieces about Black childhoods and the way that Black children have a very different kind of childhood because of racism, um, and really kind of ask questions about innocence and childhood in general. I became aware of Ebony Patterson's work from the book by Hannah Dyer called Queer Aesthetics of Childhood. It's a really fantastic book that really talks about the ways that innocence is not a guarantee for all children and what does that look like and the implications of that for thinking about education. This is Jennifer Packer's work. I actually wrote about this in the book that Breton edited with some other people. This is a massive piece. I've seen this in person. This is a scene of that is the artist has said that this is Breonna Taylor's boyfriend before the police came in and killed Breonna Taylor. So again, kind of offering a very different layer and perspective on the story of police brutality, stories about home and safety, race, violence. This is another piece by Jennifer Packer. She does these portraits that are not clear, right? They're not an easy representation, and they're quite large often too. I have a quote from Jennifer Packer about this exhibit, which was at the Whitney in I think like 2021. So Packer says, my inclination to paint, especially from life, is a completely political one. We belong here. We deserve to be seen and acknowledged in real time. We deserve to be heard and to be imagined with shameless generosity and accuracy. This is Carrie James Marshall's Beauty Examined, which is also a very large piece. Carrie Mae Weems, this is a little bit distorted, sorry about that, but I really love this photograph. Um, she's most famous for the kitchen table series, where it's just, I think I have some of these pictures. So this is from the kitchen table series. And then I will conclude with, this is another kind of still from Arthur Jafa's Love is the Message is Death. I would highly recommend, if you're curious, for you to look it up. Again, it's on YouTube, and it's all these images that are these clips from video that are pretty familiar probably to a lot of people, but how he puts them together. A lot of writing has been done about this, academic writing, but also magazines, articles. He does a lot of press stuff. So, yeah. So I'm going to show this slide one last time as I conclude. The story cannot tell itself without our willingness to imagine what it cannot tell. The story asks that we live with what cannot be explained and live with unexplained cues and diasporic literacies rather than reams of positivist evidence. The story opens the door to curiosity. The reams of evidence dissipate as we live with the difficult and frustrating ways of knowing differentially. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I timed myself.
That was amazing timing. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. So I'm seeing some questions coming in the Q&A, so I will read those. And then if anyone at the watch party has questions, you can, I guess, come up to the computer and type them into the Zoom Q&A, or you can give them to Brett and Varga, and he can text them to me. So let us know if you have questions. And then if you're on Zoom, go ahead and go to that Q&A, or you can type your question into the chat, and I will read a couple of questions. So the first one is, you have a great set of viewing questions for student activities. I particularly appreciate the call to think about what is not in the image, which was a key question two of my grad school mentors stressed. Is that available somewhere, or could you put it back on the screen?
Sure.
Or would you be willing to share? Yeah, I guess it was yeah, so that's the question.
I'm totally willing to share.
Thank
Yes.
you. Awesome.
I'll send it to you, Catherine. Is
Yeah,
that okay?
thank you. Yeah, anything you want to share, and then I can send it out to the email list of folks who are here. So let's see if I'm having any other questions coming in. I always love to ask the question, which you, oh, well, here's one coming in. I have another one that I'll keep in the back of my mind, but I'll read this one from Daisy. Oh, that was a logistical question. Okay, here's my question. You definitely talked about this like throughout the presentation, but I just love to always give us a chance to talk a little bit more about teaching practice. So can you talk a little bit more about what kinds of things can teachers do? A lot of the folks that are here are either undergrads that are thinking about becoming teachers, or they're in their teaching credential program and they're interested in like, strategies for what they can do. So if you could take a second to talk a little bit more about that and just give them any advice that you may have.
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. I think part of it is that aesthetics, art, images are very marginalized in traditional educational spaces. Um, and, I think a lot of kind of media literacy, there's people in education who talk about media literacy, right? People in art education talk about visual literacy, but it still feels like it's not really something that we are kind of taking seriously, even as students are encountering a number of images, much, much more, many would say, than in previous times. And a lot of those images are purposefully meant to tell a certain story about certain groups of people, about, and it's really actually important that we figure out a way to engage these. So I think depending on, with young children, even asking some of those questions. What do you see? And when you do that collaboratively, you really learn very quickly that we're seeing different things. And the fact that you see this and I see that really kind of, I think, can sensitize us to that it's not, seeing is not believing, right? We're looking at different things in different ways because of the our different experiences, our different socialization. So it really does politicize looking in a way that doesn't take it for granted. So that can be something super small, right? Or even asking students, if you're reading a text, having students bring an image that they think about, right? Like if you're reading, if you're teaching elementary school and you're reading a book about, I don't know, a farm, right? And students bring in pictures of farms, and you might have very different pictures that they bring in. And doing that work together is, why did you bring this in? What is, what about this image makes you think of a farm? What are some of your experiences on a farm, right? Kind of understanding that there's a lot that goes into us making meaning out of images, is one thing. For older kids, it's very, very exciting. They have so much more. I mean, what I learned from the undergrads in my this is why I love pop culture. I love teaching that class because I learned about music, film. My students are like, you would love this. I listened to this album 10 times. I think that part of it is, I know I'm kind of going on, but part of it is the hardest part for me being a professor right now is that so many of our students have learned that anything to do with learning sucks and it's boring and is not relevant and is a chore and is a task. And that is the worst part about my job. And so much of my job has become convincing students that learning and thinking and asking questions and being curious is in itself the reward, right? And I think that in pop culture and in art, that case is much easier to make because they're like, when I show Arthur Jafa's Love is the Message, like students are so excited and destabilized. In the contemporary art class, I focused on performance art, difficult performance art. And some of the things that we looked at were just completely upsetting, right? In a good way. And in a way that they have not been able to unthink or unknow or unsee. And that is kind of always what I'm figuring out. How can we do more of that in these institutions that have a very, very narrow, old, boring notion of teaching and learning? And I I think that education is particularly bad in sort of very limited understandings of what counts in classroom. So I would say to people who want to be teachers, how can you figure out how to expand concepts of teaching and learning even in institutions and settings that have very, very narrow notions of it? And what that means is you're going to be in opposition all the time. Ed studies were always in opposition in our school of education. So the long answer, but maybe that's, I don't know. Maybe
That's
that's
amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm gonna rewatch it. I'm glad we're recording because I loved everything you said. Thank you so much for that. There's a bunch of other questions that have just come in, and I see Breton has opened his video. So did you have a question from the watch party?
I do. Thank you so much for all the great ideas, Asilia. What wonderful presentation. So this question reads, what are diasporic literacies and how do they relate to ways of seeing and knowing? If you could talk a little bit about that, that would be awesome.
sure. I mean, I think that like meaning making practices that come from different places, right? That's what McKittrick is talking about. And part of it is because there's such a hierarchy of knowledge. And the ways that Black, Indigenous, people of color have known and made meaning in the world have been either obscured, ignored, pathologized, right? And so, what does it look like to take seriously those ways of learning and making meaning in the world? So, I think it's in education, we talk about like diverse books, and I think that that's like important, but often 1% of what needs to happen. Um, it's about what are other ways of looking at the world, right? We talk a lot about in I teach sociology and philosophy of education. I think I teach 16 different classes here. So um I teach sociology and philosophy of education. And one of the things we talk a lot about is the ways that certain ways of looking at the world are understood to be universal. And I think part of what is much more interesting is what about there's people around the world who don't think, I mean, like here's a great example. I was teaching a bunch of PE teachers a couple years ago, and we had this like very spirited debate, I would say. They were yelling. I wasn't yelling, but they were yelling that competition, being competitive, is a natural human trait, right? Like they were stuck on that as a natural. There's nothing you can do about it. If other people get their feelings hurt about it, too bad. And I really pushed and pushed and pushed. So things like that. The idea that something that is very feels very true to you because it's been validated and rehearsed and repeated over and over and over again. What does it look like to consider other perspectives that have a different truth about those things? So I think that that's a very different kinds of education than the one that most of us have had access to.
Thank you so much. I have three more from the Zoom, and we're good on time. So I'll go ahead and read those. And then if there's any others from the watch party, just keep on sending them. Um, so what do you look for in art images or videos when choosing them for your lectures?
Oh, I love that question. I like what I honestly, a lot of it's what I like. Part of it is that when I teach when I teach contemporary art, this is very funny. So the class that I taught, all of them were future art teachers. Almost universally, they hated contemporary art. So they didn't think that contemporary art had anything to do with being an art teacher. That art teacher was about the technique. That's how they understood art. Also, contemporary art, a lot of it, anybody can do it. That's another thing that they would say. Um, but like anyone didn't do it, but that's a different conversation. And it's not true. It's not true. They would respect a lot of the art that I show today because it does have a lot of technique. But when I showed them conceptual art or performance art or like the mattress art, they would be like, this is an art. But we really challenge that. Who gets to decide? So I think part of what the kind of art that I choose is I want a different story. How does the art tell a story that's unfamiliar to a lot of the students? Or provocative or contested where they can debate around it. Um, there's an artist, I can't remember the name right now, but he hires people who are really on the margins of the economy, living on the street, struggling with addiction. He hires them to be a part of this art performance. He pays them, but we had a really great conversation about the ethics of that, right? What does it mean to really kind of potentially enrich yourself off of the labor of someone who is desperate? So thinking about those questions, it becomes such a site of complex discussion. So I'm looking for things that cannot have an easy response. Difficult things, challenging things, things that deal with a topic that people feel like they're familiar with, but from such a different perspective with such a different conclusion. So things that are difficult actually or challenging.
I'm back. Can I ask
Hi.
hi, can I ask one follow-up question to something that
Yeah.
you were saying, and maybe you can riff off of it a little bit more? Can you talk a little bit about the spaces in which art is consumed? And in your classes, does this get brought up? I think one of my favorite parts about your presentation was how there are just patterns being established in all of these different entry points, right? Some of them are formalized gallery spaces that you talked about. Others were institutional, everyday, flows of life. Can you talk a little bit about how seeing connects to or is an attachment to like how we come to be in a space?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think like I I think that the art museum, the art exhibit, is very, there's a lot of problems with it. Um, there's an artist named Young Jake who has this exhibit. He does like the emoji portraits where he takes a bunch of different emojis and does these amazing portraits. If you're interested, you should look up his work. He's also a rapper too. But he's trained as a fine. I think he went to one of the top art schools. But one of his art pieces was a gallery that he threw a party in and had all his friends who were a lot of street artists, a lot of people who were not welcomed in the gallery space. And they had a party, trashed the space. And he was really talking about interrupting and disrupting some of those norms around galleries and art exhibits. And I think part of what already is happening is that when you open up the space and allow different kinds of people into that space, something different happens. And that's why that space is so guarded. Um, People have art shows at bodegas, in alleys, in the trunks of cars. People are doing all kinds of very cool, interesting things to challenge some of that. Um, so we do talk a lot about that. The other thing is that um, the art education program at my school is very, very white, more white than the our teacher education program, which also is quite white. So we talk a lot about that and what that means. Um, yeah, no, I think part of it is I'm always interested in what happens if we don't expect these spaces to change in any meaningful way and how that changes our relationship to it. So teaching kids, an organization called Black Girls in Art Spaces, and it's an organization that sets up these different events at different art exhibits to get people that are often feel excluded or not invited into these spaces together to go into those spaces. So I think that's really interesting. And yeah, we talk about it. I think it's all about figuring out how to do what we want to do. And if people are staring at us or don't like us there, too bad. Too bad for them. Right?
I have one more that I think we have time for, if that's okay.
Of
And
course.
there's several more questions, which is amazing. I love it's like the best problem to have. But I'm gonna read one. And I think we have maybe time for one more. So one idea that came up was inviting students to sit with those aspects of a story that make them uncomfortable. What are some ways you've found to increase students' capacity to sit with that discomfort and resist the temptation for tidy closure?
It's a great question. I'm going to try to be quick about it. I mean, I think it's about my colleague, Robin Sheridan was just here. She's the co-coordinator, and we talk a lot about this. I think it's about practice. I think people are uncomfortable with things that they don't have practice engaging. So, when I first started teaching these classes many years ago, I was so nervous and so stressed out every day. Now I forget that everyone hasn't paid attention to these things for a decade. And so I can be like sometimes a little too comfortable saying and doing things that are kind of new to students. Actually, I told Breton this story a couple weeks ago. A student said the N word in my class. And a long story short, I was sitting there in the front of the class. And I mean, I definitely had a reaction, but it wasn't, you know, um, and I looked behind me and everyone's mouth was wide open with their, they were like freaked out. So I think part of it is like, how do you practice these things, right? Practice over and over and over. And most of us, especially if we are not only, but especially if we are in a dominant cultural group, don't really have to reach outside of our comfort, like do not need to go to performance art shows and watch films that are challenging. So I think, what does it look like where that, I mean, bell hooks talks about the pleasure of critique, that there's a pleasure. It's not just ruining it, right? To look at something with critique. So I think just practice small over and over and over again. So it's actually just a normal way of being in the world where you are noticing how race is working, how violence is working, and you're awake to those things. I guess we can't use the word woke anymore, but right, like
Awake. Yeah.
awake, yes.
Okay, I can't help it. I'm gonna ask one more. I'm interested in the idea that art can create ruptures in the dominant paradigms. Over the course of history, art has mostly been in the service of structures of power, especially religion and state. Um, how far back and how widely in the present do you trace the rupturing power of art? It's a long question, but can you talk a little bit more about that for a couple minutes?
Sure. I mean, I think that, like, I just read Faith Ringgold's memoir, who really was kind of like one of the earlier famous Black woman artists. Um, and I think the difference is that very few, up until very recently, and even now, there still are not that many Black artists, right? That it still is a very closed space for people who would have different perspectives, different ideas about things. And I think that's what's shifting. So when you look at art from Asian American artists, queer artists, people who were really kept out of the fine art space up until very recently, I think that's an important shift, right? That, like, and they're and those people are still very much kept out of the art space, right? That it's the doors open a tiny, tiny, tiny bit. And um and that work is coming from just a very different place, a very different relationship to art, a very different politics. So I think that that's the kind of work that I'm talking about. And again, if you are interested in this, you should definitely read A Black Gaze by Tina Kant. There's also a bunch of new Duke books that are about Black contemporary art, um, that are pretty recent, like in the last month, I mean, year. I don't know if that answers the question.
It totally does. Thank you so much. And I apologize. I didn't ask you the whole question because there were so many sub questions, but I just wanted to focus on that one part. But I love that. I mean, we talk a lot about counter storytelling in some of our courses. Um, and coming out of critical race theory and what that looks like in classrooms. And some of my students have done projects where they try to bring counter storytelling into the classroom. And it sounds, kind of similar to what we're talking about here with ruptures. Um, and I love it. I love it. I'm definitely gonna rewatch this one and make sure that I get the transcript of this recording so I can get all the references that you're giving us and all the books and things like that, and the videos. So I'm gonna send a survey link. So please don't leave. If you could stick around for just a second to grab the survey link, and then I'm gonna say a couple of words of conclusion. So just one second. Somehow my Zoom window crashed, so I'm not even gonna. I'll send out the survey afterwards to everyone who RSVP'd, and you can take the survey later. But thank you so much. I really appreciate having you. This was amazing. Thank you, Dr. Varga, for connecting us. And we just really, really appreciate this. This has been wonderful. And I know that our teachers are going to get a lot of ideas for how to, implement this in their classrooms, because that's really what we try to do is, like, we have all these theoretical discussions, but how do we put this into practice? So I really appreciate everything you shared about putting theory into practice. I think that's super, super valuable for our teachers. Anything else that you wanted to add, Brenton?
Just a huge thank you from all of us here at the watch party. We had pizza. We enjoyed your talk. We got to listen to what you had to say. We got to see some great art. Thank you so much. We'll
Thank
talk.
you. Thank you so much for all this work. I know I've put together events. I know it's no small task. So really appreciate you having me and spending your work evening with me. See you later. Have a great night.
I forgot I'm also going to send out a Zoom link to a regular Zoom for people who want to have a little discussion. So if anyone on Zoom wants to stick around and talk for a little while, we're in a webinar format right now, so we can't do that here. But if you're interested in having a little discussion, I'm going to place the link in the chat. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We'll go ahead and conclude. If you want to stay for the link, I'm trying to reopen all my tabs to find that link and send it out. Here we go. Thank you so much. Okay, there's the link. I'll give everybody a minute to just open the link before I close down this Zoom for people who want to go into a regular Zoom, and then we will continue. Danielle, I'm not sure what happened. Danielle came in here somehow. Okay. So yeah, there's a link in the chat to a regular Zoom. There's no passcode. So if you want to join us for that, click on that, and then I'll close this one out and I will switch over to the other regular Zoom.